January 17, 1944. Eastern Germany.
28,000 feet.
The winter sky stretched pale and infinite, a sheet of frozen silver broken only by the thin contrails of aircraft engines carving white scars across the firmament. The air at this altitude bit with a cold so severe it turned moisture to ice crystals on cockpit glass within seconds. Below, the patchwork fields of Saxony lay buried under snow, the forests dark as spilled ink, the villages reduced to clusters of gray stone barely distinguishable from the frozen earth. And there, high above it all, a single American fighter, a P-51 Mustang bearing the olive drab and neutral gray of the 8th Air Force, banked hard into the morning sun, its Packard-built Merlin engine howling a challenge that would echo through Luftwaffe radio frequencies for the next 18 minutes. Inside the cockpit, Second Lieutenant James Howard, 23 years old, son of a Missouri wheat farmer, adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the sky with eyes trained by 10,000 hours of watching weather patterns roll across open prairie. He had learned to read the land from his father's tractor seat, learned to anticipate the wind by watching how it bent the stalks, learned patience by waiting for rain that sometimes never came. Now those same instincts, born of soil and seasons, and the relentless optimism required to coax life from stubborn ground, were about to be tested against the most sophisticated aerial warfare machine ever assembled by the Third Reich. The radio crackled. German voices, clipped and urgent, filled the ether. Howard didn't speak their language fluently, but he understood the tone. Interceptors were vectoring in. Many of them. He was alone, separated from his squadron during the bomber escort mission, and the sky was about to become very crowded. What happened next would become legend whispered in Luftwaffe ready rooms, studied in tactical briefings, and ultimately documented in after-action reports that Allied intelligence officers would read with expressions of disbelief. For 30 minutes, a farm boy from St. Louis would transform the sky over Germany into his personal proving ground, leaving a trail of smoking aircraft and shattered Nazi confidence in his wake. And through it all, German radio operators would broadcast the same phrase again and again, their voices rising from professional composure to something approaching panic. Zu schnell, ist zu schnell, too fast. Well, he's too fast. The American pilot was not supposed to be there at all, at least not according to the careful calculations of Luftwaffe command. By January 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over occupied Europe had settled into a brutal arithmetic of attrition. American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators penetrated German airspace in formations of hundreds, their defensive firepower concentrated into boxes of coordinated fire that could shred attacking fighters. But those bombers were slow, predictable, vulnerable during the long transit to and from their targets deep in the Reich. The Luftwaffe had adapted, positioning interceptor groups, Jagdschwader equipped with Bf-109s and Fw-190s along known approach routes, waiting to strike at the moment when American fighter escorts reached the limit of their range and were forced to turn back. It was a system built on geometric certainty. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's primary escort fighter through 1943, could accompany bombers only as far as the German border before fuel considerations forced withdrawal. This left a gap, a window of vulnerability hundreds of miles wide, during which German interceptors could attack with relative impunity. Luftwaffe doctrine exploited this ruthlessly. Fighter controllers tracked the bomber streams, waited for the escorts to depart, then committed their forces in waves designed to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers and coordinated assault. The German pilots expected this pattern to hold forever. They had been told, repeatedly and with absolute conviction, that American fighters lacked the range for deep penetration missions. Their training emphasized this vulnerability, their tactics assumed it, their very understanding of aerial warfare was built upon the foundation that an interceptor force, operating from interior lines with short distances to target, would always hold positional advantage over escorts forced to burn fuel traversing hostile airspace. This was not propaganda or wishful thinking. This was mathematics, physics, the cold logic of fuel consumption rates and combat radius calculations. The Americans could build all the fighters they wanted. It wouldn't matter if those fighters couldn't reach the battle space. Then the Mustang arrived, and the mathematics changed. James Howard had not grown up dreaming of aerial combat. He had grown up dreaming of rains. Missouri in the 1920s and 30s had been a land of perpetual negotiation with drought, where families measured their futures in inches of precipitation, and a good harvest meant survival, while a bad one meant abandoning the land his grandfather had cleared with an axe and mule team. Howard learned to fly because it seemed practical. Crop dusting paid better than plowing, and the skills transferred easily to the civilian aviation jobs proliferating across the Midwest in the late 1930s. He was good at it, naturally so, the way some men are naturally good with horses or machinery. He understood three-dimensional space intuitively, could judge distance and closure rate without conscious calculation, could feel through the control surfaces what the aircraft wanted to do before the instruments registered change. When war came, he enlisted not out of ideology or hatred, but because it seemed like the right thing to do, the same way you helped a neighbor raise a barn or brought in someone else's harvest when sickness struck their family. The Army Air Forces tested him, trained him, and assigned him to fighters not because he was aggressive or particularly martial, but because his instructors noted an unusual quality in his flying, a smoothness, an economy of motion, an ability to place the aircraft exactly where it needed to be with minimal wasted energy. He flew the way a farmer worked a field, efficiently, patiently, with an understanding that you didn't fight the machine any more than you fought the land. You worked with it, learned its rhythms, became part of a system larger than yourself. By January 1944, Howard had flown 23 combat missions over France and Germany. He was competent, reliable, unremarkable in the way that good soldiers often are. His wingmen trusted him. His commanders considered him solid. No one, including Howard himself, suspected that he carried within him the capacity for what was about to unfold. But then, no one had yet given him a reason to discover what a Missouri farm boy could do when the arithmetic of survival became simple and immediate. The P-51 beneath him, that made all the difference. The Mustang was not the fastest American fighter, nor the most heavily armed, nor the most rugged. What it possessed was range. Extraordinary, unprecedented range. By mating the American P-51 airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, engineers had accidentally created the first fighter capable of escorting bombers to any target in Germany and returning home. With drop tanks, a Mustang could fly 8 hours, cover 1,500 miles, and still retain enough fuel for 30 minutes of combat. It rendered obsolete every assumption upon which German defensive doctrine rested. The unassailable sanctuary of distance had vanished overnight. But range meant nothing without the pilot to exploit it. And on this particular morning, James Howard was about to provide a demonstration that would force Luftwaffe intelligence to reconsider everything they thought they understood about American fighter capability. The first contacts appeared as dark specks against the sun, a classic approach, forcing Howard to squint through glare. He counted 6, then 8, then 12 Bf-109s in loose formation, positioning for a coordinated bounce. They expected him to run. Standard doctrine for an isolated fighter encountering superior numbers was withdrawal, diving for speed and cloud cover, preserving aircraft and pilot for another engagement. The Germans had seen this pattern hundreds of times. They maneuvered accordingly, splitting into elements to cut off escape routes, setting up the aerial trap that had claimed so many American pilots over the past 2 years. Howard turned toward them, not away, not into evasive maneuvers, directly toward the formation, as if daring them to commit. The German element leaders hesitated, just for a moment, confused by the response. Was this pilot suicidal? Inexperienced? The hesitation cost them initiative. Howard selected his target, the lead 109 in the nearest element, and opened fire at a range most pilots would consider excessive. Tracers arced across the sky. The German fighter shuddered, trailing white coolant vapor, and broke hard left. Howard anticipated the break, rolled inverted, pulled through, and settled onto the 109 tail with the smoothness of a hawk stooping on a rabbit. He fired again. Short burst. The German aircraft disintegrated, pieces tumbling through the frozen air. 11 remaining. The radio exploded with German voices, no longer professional but urgent, confused. The tactical frequency that had been calm moments before now carried the sharp bark of warnings, position calls, overlapping transmissions that spoke to a formation losing cohesion. Howard didn't understand the words, but he understood the music. They were reacting now, not executing, and reaction meant lost initiative. He pulled hard 4G turn, felt the pressure vest squeeze his legs and torso, kept his vision clear through technique his instructor had drilled into him. Tighten the core, grunt against the pressure, keep blood in the brain. The Mustang responded like it was part of his body, wingover into vertical, rolling scissors that brought him face to face with a second 109. Both pilots fired. The German's rounds snapped past Howard's canopy. He felt the aircraft shudder with hits somewhere in the fuselage, but his own guns found their mark. The 109 engine cowling blew apart in a spray of oil and metal. The pilot bailed out immediately, canopy jettisoning, figure tumbling through space before the parachute blossomed white against the dark earth below. 10 remaining. They should have overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. 12 against 1 offered impossible odds, multiple firing solutions, overlapping fields of fire that should have torn the Mustang apart within minutes. But the Germans had trained to fight bomber escorts operating at the edge of their fuel, pilots nursing damaged aircraft home, formations weakened by hours of high-altitude flight. They had not trained to fight a pilot operating from a position of absolute confidence in his aircraft's endurance, willing to burn fuel and ammunition in a sustained engagement because he knew, with the certainty of a farmer who has checked the tank and knows exactly how many acres he can plow, that he had enough to finish the job. Howard fought the way he had harvested wheat, methodically, without pause, working through the field row by row until the work was done. He used the Mustang's superior speed in the dive to build energy, climbed back to altitude, repeated. Each attack cost the Germans options, forced them to react to his timing, disrupted their attempts to coordinate. He was rewriting the geometry of the engagement in real time, transforming a defensive situation into something fluid and unpredictable, where training and doctrine became liabilities instead of assets. Zu schnell, the radio call, intercepted later by Allied listening posts, carried an edge of desperation. The Mustang was too fast in the dive for the 109s to follow, too maneuverable in the vertical for them to track, and the pilot, this inexplicable farm boy from Missouri, seemed capable of sustaining the pace indefinitely. Where was his wingman? Where was his squadron? Why wasn't he breaking off? The questions accumulated, unanswered, while the number of intact German fighters continued to diminish. By the standards of the Third Reich's propaganda machine, the Luftwaffe pilot was the apotheosis of Aryan martial excellence, scientifically selected, rigorously trained, equipped with aircraft representing the finest achievements of German engineering. The fighter arms successes over Poland, France, and the Low Countries had been presented as evidence of innate superiority, confirmation that a racially pure warrior caste, properly led and equipped, represented an unstoppable force. This narrative had been reinforced through countless newsreels, magazine articles, and Hitler Youth lectures. The German people had learned to revere their fighter pilots as modern knights, heirs to the aces of the First World War, embodiments of national destiny. What they had not been told, what perhaps even Luftwaffe command did not fully understand until encounters like this forced the recognition, was that wars of attrition do not reward breeding or ideology. They reward industrial capacity, resource depth, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. America possessed these advantages in quantities that rendered individual pilot quality almost irrelevant at strategic scale. For every German ace with 30 kills, America could field 100 competent pilots in aircraft that rolled off assembly lines at rates that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war planners. But Howard was not merely competent, and this engagement was demonstrating something that terrified Luftwaffe intelligence analysts more than American numbers ever could: the possibility that American training, far from producing mediocre pilots through mass production methods, was actually achieving remarkable consistency of quality. Howard had not been selected for any elite unit. He had not attended special schools or received extraordinary training. He was representative, and if a representative American fighter pilot could do this, what did that imply about the overall quality of the thousands of others flying similar missions across occupied Europe? The third 109 died in a head-on pass, both aircraft firing simultaneously, neither pilot willing to break first. At the last possible instant, Howard snap-rolled right, avoiding collision by feet while his rounds walked through the German fighter's engine. It fell away smoking, pilot visible through the canopy, struggling with controls that no longer responded. Howard didn't watch it fall. He was already acquiring the next target, a Focke-Wulf 190 trying to position above him. The FW-190 was faster than the 109, more heavily armed, a brutally effective interceptor that had given Allied pilots nightmares since its introduction. Howard treated it with the same methodical aggression he had shown the others, trading altitude for speed, using the Mustang's better sustained turn rate to force an overshoot, then converting his positional advantage into another kill. 9 remaining, then 8, then 7. The German formation was disintegrating, not through casualties alone, but through psychological collapse. They had committed 12 aircraft to kill 1 American fighter, a trivial task by pre-war standards, and instead found themselves being systematically destroyed by a pilot who seemed incapable of making mistakes. Every maneuver they attempted, Howard countered. Every trap they set, he avoided. And through it all, that damned aircraft, the Mustang they had been assured lacked the performance to challenge German fighters in close combat, proved equal or superior to their own mounts in every regime except maximum speed. The radio calls shifted from tactical instructions to warnings, then to something approaching panic. Controllers on the ground, monitoring the engagement through radio traffic and radar plots, issued increasingly urgent orders: break off, disengage, reform. But disengaging from an aggressive opponent at high altitude requires coordination and discipline, and both were fragmenting under Howard's relentless pressure. When one element tried to dive away, Howard followed, shot down another 109, then climbed back into the fight before the remaining Germans could organize a response. When another pair tried to bracket him in a pincer, he split them with a vertical reversal that left both pilots overshooting, vulnerable, exposed. Ist zu schnell. The call was intercepted by 3 separate Allied listening posts, recorded, translated, and eventually filed in intelligence reports that would be studied for decades. Well, he's too fast. Not the aircraft, the pilots. The German radio operators had stopped trying to track the Mustang's position and were simply calling out warnings that an American fighter was somewhere in their airspace, moving too fast to pin down, too aggressive to escape, piloted by someone who fought with a cold precision that turned aerial combat into something approaching execution. What the Germans could not have known, what perhaps Howard himself did not consciously recognize until this moment, was that his tactics emerged directly from his background in a way that made them almost impossible for Luftwaffe doctrine to counter. German fighter training emphasized formation discipline, coordinated attacks, and tactical protocols designed to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources. Pilots learned to fight as part of a system, trusting their wingmen, adhering to proven methods that had succeeded in earlier campaigns. This approach worked brilliantly when both sides operated under similar constraints and assumptions. But Howard had not learned to fly within a military system. He had learned alone in civilian aircraft, over landscapes where the nearest help might be an hour away, and mechanical failure meant a forced landing in hostile terrain. He had developed an independence of action and decision-making that military training typically suppressed in favor of unit cohesion. When separated from his squadron, he didn't feel vulnerable or exposed. He felt exactly as comfortable as he had barnstorming across Missouri, alone, self-reliant, responsible only for his own survival and the completion of his mission. The isolation that would have paralyzed a pilot, trained exclusively in formation tactics, liberated Howard to fight exactly as he chose, without concern for maintaining position or coordinating with elements that didn't exist. Moreover, his farming background had instilled a particular approach to work that transferred perfectly to sustained aerial combat. Farmers didn't quit when tired. They didn't stop to rest when the work became monotonous. They certainly didn't abandon a field half-finished because the task seemed overwhelming. You started at one end, worked methodically to the other, and when you finished, the job was done. Howard applied this mentality to the engagement, treating each German fighter not as a terrifying opponent, but as another task to be completed, another row to be harvested. There was no emotion in it, no exhilaration or fear, just the steady application of skill and effort until the work reached completion. The 5th kill came from a deflection shot at a 109 braking hard left, trying to escape. Howard led the target perfectly, fired a 2-second burst, and watched the German fighter's tail section separate from the fuselage. The pilot ejected immediately, parachute snapping open so close to the tumbling wreckage that the shroud lines nearly tangled. Howard was already turning back toward the remaining aircraft, engine screaming, airframe groaning under the sustained high-G maneuvering, but holding together because American factories had built it to withstand exactly this kind of abuse. 6 remaining. Then 5. Then, after a particularly vicious climbing spiral that ended with a FW-190 stalling out and spinning into the overcast, 4. The survivors broke and ran. It was not a coordinated, tactical withdrawal. It was flight, pure and simple. each pilot independently deciding that survival trumped mission completion and diving for the deck at maximum speed. Howard watched them go, considered pursuit, then checked his fuel gauges and ammunition counters. He had enough for perhaps 10 more minutes of combat, but the bombers he had been assigned to escort were now far ahead, approaching their initial point undefended. The Germans were beaten. Continuing the engagement would be satisfying, but strategically meaningless. He turned west, toward home, and keyed his radio to report position and status. The response from his squadron leader came through broken by static but unmistakable in its disbelief. "Say again your kill count." Howard repeated the number. 8 confirmed, possibly more damaged. 30 minutes of continuous combat against a numerically superior force, and he had suffered only minor damage to his aircraft, a few holes in the tail section, nothing that affected controllability. He was returning with partial fuel and approximately 60 rounds remaining in his ammunition bays. Mission accomplished. The radio went silent for several seconds. "Then copy that, Lieutenant. Welcome home." The German pilots who survived the engagement landed at their bases shaken, confused, and in several cases, quietly furious. Their after-action reports, preserved in Luftwaffe archives and later captured by Allied investigators, make for remarkable reading. They describe not an aerial battle but an execution, a one-sided encounter where every advantage of numbers, position, and local knowledge failed to produce results. Several pilots questioned whether they had actually faced a single American fighter, or whether they had somehow encountered an entire squadron operating with perfect coordination. Others speculated that the Mustang pilot must have been a captured German ace flying for the Allies, because no American could possibly demonstrate that level of skill. This last theory gained particular traction in German intelligence circles, not because it was plausible, but because it was preferable to the alternative explanation, that American pilot training had reached or exceeded Luftwaffe standards, while simultaneously producing pilots at 10 times the rate. If Howard was exceptional, an outlier, then the engagement could be dismissed as an anomaly. But if Howard was representative, if the American pilot you encountered tomorrow or next week might be equally capable, then the war had already been lost, regardless of how many more Focke-Wulfs rolled out of the Regensburg factory or how many more Tiger tanks were committed to the Eastern Front. Luftwaffe Command responded to reports of the engagement with a flurry of tactical bulletins and training directives. Squadrons were reminded to maintain formation discipline, avoid piecemeal commitment, and break off engagements with isolated American fighters if they proved unexpectedly capable. These directives were sensible, professional, and almost entirely beside the point. They addressed tactical problems, pilot decision-making, unit coordination, while ignoring the strategic reality that American industrial capacity was flooding the skies over Europe with aircraft that German factories could no longer match in quantity or quality. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them, losing fuel faster than refineries could produce it, and losing time as Allied bomber formations methodically destroyed the infrastructure required to sustain modern aerial warfare. The war would continue for another 16 months, but the outcome was already determined. Germany had bet everything on a short war of maneuver and decisive victory, had staked the Reich's future on military excellence compensating for material disadvantage. It had failed, and in the frozen sky over Saxony, in the 30 minutes James Howard spent systematically dismantling a German interceptor squadron, that failure had been rendered undeniable. Howard returned to England, debriefed, filed his combat report, and went to eat dinner in the officers' mess. He was exhausted in the particular way that comes from sustained adrenaline followed by sudden safety, the kind of fatigue that makes food tasteless and conversation impossible. He ate mechanically, potatoes, some kind of meat he didn't identify, bread, and fell asleep in his quarters without undressing. The next morning, he woke to find his squadron mates treating him with a peculiar mixture of awe and confusion. Word of the engagement had spread through the entire fighter group. Pilots who had flown dozens of missions without encountering opposition now asked Howard questions he couldn't really answer. How did you keep track of all of them? Weren't you afraid? What made you turn toward them instead of running? He tried to explain and found himself talking about wheat harvests and summer storms over the Missouri River Valley, about the importance of finishing what you started and not letting fear make your decisions for you. His audience nodded politely and clearly understood none of it. They thought he was being modest or evasive, concealing some secret tactical insight that had enabled his success. They didn't understand that there was no secret, no special technique beyond competence, aggression, and the absolute confidence that his aircraft would perform as designed for as long as he needed it. The medal came through 6 weeks later. The Congressional Medal of Honor, presented by Theater Command at a ceremony Howard endured with the same stoic patience he had once applied to church services back home. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism, his disregard for personal safety, his single-handed defense of bomber formations against overwhelming odds. It was all true and somehow completely missed the point. Howard hadn't disregarded his safety. He had simply assessed the situation and determined that attacking offered better survival odds than running. He hadn't defended bombers out of extraordinary heroism, but because that was his mission, the task he had been assigned, and you didn't abandon tasks just because they became difficult. But he accepted the medal gracefully, said the right things to the reporters, and went back to flying missions. There would be 49 more before the war in Europe ended, none as dramatic as the engagement over Saxony, but each flown with the same methodical competence that had characterized that frozen January morning. He survived the war without additional wounds, returned to Missouri, married, raised children, and lived to see the 21st century arrive with all its technological marvels and historical reassessments. In interviews conducted decades later, after the Cold War ended and German military archives were open to researchers, Howard was shown transcripts of the Luftwaffe radio intercepts from that engagement. He read the repeated calls, "Zu schnell, ist zu schnell," and smiled the way farmers smile when city people express amazement at the amount of work involved in maintaining a farm. "They thought I was fast," he said. "I wasn't fast. I just didn't stop moving." That's what you do when there's work to be done. You keep going until it's finished. The P-51 Mustang, that elegant fusion of American production capacity and British aeronautical engineering, became the symbol of Allied air superiority over Europe. More than 15,000 were built before production ceased, and they served in every theater of the war, flown by pilots from a dozen nations, maintained by ground crews who often worked through the night to keep them operational. But the aircraft was only part of the story. The more important element, the decisive advantage that transformed the strategic bombing campaign from a costly gamble into an unstoppable offensive, was the pilot pool that American training programs produced in seemingly limitless quantity. German propaganda had mocked this production line approach to pilot training, contrasting it unfavorably with the Luftwaffe's selective, intensive methods. But the mockery rang hollow as the war progressed and German losses mounted. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots entering combat averaged less than half the training hours their American opponents received. They flew inferior aircraft, burned synthetic fuel that damaged engines, and faced numerical odds that rendered individual skill increasingly irrelevant. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with perhaps the finest fighter pilots in the world. It ended the war with teenagers in cockpits, thrust into combat after minimal training, dying in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1939. America had chosen a different path. Rather than select for elite warriors and train them exhaustively, American programs focused on creating competent professionals in large numbers, pilots who understood their aircraft, knew basic tactics, and could function effectively as part of a larger system. The approach prioritized consistency over excellence, reliability over brilliance. And in a long war of attrition, consistency mattered far more than individual genius. James Howard represented the success of this system, not because he was average, but because his excellence emerged from standard training, standard equipment, and a background that had nothing to do with military traditions or martial culture. He was a farmer who learned to fly. When war came, he applied the same principles that had guided him through droughts and harvest seasons, and the grinding daily work of wresting a living from indifferent soil. He fought with competence, aggression, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of the odds. And in doing so, he embodied something that terrified the architects of the Third Reich far more than any bomber stream or tank column: the possibility that democracy, for all its apparent inefficiency and chaos, could produce citizens capable of matching or exceeding anything authoritarian systems created through rigid selection and control. The story of that January morning over Saxony rippled through both air forces in the weeks that followed, acquiring the status of legend among American pilots and cautionary tale among their German counterparts. For the Americans, it confirmed what they wanted to believe about themselves: that individual initiative and courage could triumph over numerical odds, that their aircraft and training gave them an edge that compensated for inexperience, that the war would be won by men like Howard, ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded. It was good for morale, useful for recruitment, and happened to be largely true. For the Germans, the engagement represented something more ominous: evidence that the qualitative advantage they had relied upon to offset American material superiority no longer existed, if it had ever existed at all. The Luftwaffe's internal assessments, stripped of propaganda and wishful thinking, concluded that American fighter pilots had reached parity or better in training quality, while maintaining massive advantages in numbers and equipment reliability. This was not a problem that could be solved through tactical innovation or doctrinal refinement. It was a strategic failure embedded in the Reich's fundamental approach to warfare: the assumption that discipline and ideological commitment could substitute for industrial depth and resource availability. The radio intercepts, those repeated, increasingly desperate calls that an American fighter was too fast, that he was everywhere, that he couldn't be pinned down, became teaching materials at Luftwaffe training schools, used to illustrate the importance of maintaining formation discipline and avoiding piecemeal engagement. But the real lesson went unspoken because it was too demoralizing to articulate: that Germany was losing the war not through any single failure of tactics or technology, but through the cumulative weight of 1,000 American advantages, from superior aircraft engines to better pilot nutrition to logistical systems that kept fighters fueled and armed and operational at rates German commanders could only dream of achieving. And behind all of it, the most crushing reality of all: that the American system which produced James Howard was also producing hundreds, then thousands of others like him. Boys from farms and cities, from good families and broken ones, from every region and background and ethnic group that comprised the chaotic democracy German ideology claimed was decadent and weak. They arrived over Europe in endless waves, flew their missions with grinding competence, and went home to be replaced by fresh pilots equally well-trained and equally confident. The Luftwaffe was fighting not an air force but a civilization, and civilizations could not be defeated by tactical excellence alone. 79 years have passed since that frozen morning when a Missouri farm boy taught the Luftwaffe a lesson in American persistence. The participants are gone now. Howard died in 1995. The last of the German pilots who survived the engagement passed away sometime in the early 2000s. The P-51 Mustang he flew that day, if it survived the war, likely ended its life in a scrapyard or training airfield, torn down for parts or melted down for the metal. The skies over Saxony are quiet now, the contrails marking commercial aviation routes rather than bomber streams, the farms below productive and peaceful and worked by machinery that would seem miraculous to anyone who knew European agriculture in the 1940s. But the story endures, preserved in military archives and Medal of Honor citations, and the increasingly fragile memories of men who witnessed or participated in the great aerial campaigns of the Second World War. It endures because it represents something larger than one pilot's achievement or one engagement's tactical outcome. It endures because it asks a question that remains relevant long after the specific war that prompted it has faded into history. What happens when a free people, underestimated and dismissed by those who mistake chaos for weakness, decide that something matters enough to commit their full strength toward its achievement? The answer, written in the contrails of a single Mustang turning toward impossible odds rather than away from them, is that they become unstoppable, not through any single act of genius or heroism, but through the accumulated weight of a million individual decisions to keep going, to finish the job, to refuse defeat regardless of the odds. James Howard did not win the war that January morning, but in the 30 minutes he spent transforming defensive combat into aggressive prosecution. In the methodical way he worked through his assigned task despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage, he demonstrated the principle that ultimately did win it, that free men, properly equipped and convinced of their cause, will outlast any tyranny that depends on intimidation rather than consent, on ideology rather than improvisation, on rigid control rather than flexible adaptation. The Reich had built its aerial warfare doctrine on assumptions of superiority, racial, technological,